women's rights activist and the abolitionist movement. Women's rights. Women in the 19th century did not have the right to own their own property, have control of their own income, and most importantly, they were not allowed the right to vote. Though there were many prominent women's rights activists in the 19th century, two of the most prominent are Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a lifelong abolitionist and women's rights activist. She organized the Seneca Falls Convention, she founded the Revolution newspaper, and co-founded several associations dedicated to women's rights. She was a close compatriot of Lucretia Mott and Susan B. Anthony, though she later had a falling out with Susan B. Anthony. As an aside, she shares the same birthday as my wife, and my wife took her middle name as Elizabeth, partially in honor of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Lucretia Mott. Lucretia Mott also helped organize the Seneca Falls Convention. She was the first president of the Equal Rights Association, and she was a lifelong pacifist and abolitionist. The Seneca Falls Convention. The Seneca Falls Convention occurred on July 19th and 20th of 1848. It was attended by 300 women and men, and from it the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments was drafted. This declaration states that women are equal to men. Of all of the men present at the convention, Frederick Douglass was the only man to sign the declaration. The abolitionists. Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass was the most prominent abolitionist. He was a former slave and a preacher. He wrote 3 autobiographies and was the first African-American vice presidential candidate. Though he was the most prominent of the abolitionists, there were many during this period, such as Martin R. Delaney, Henry Bibb, and Henry Highland Garnet. The American Colonization Society. The American Colonization Society was an organization that sought to repatriate freed blacks back to Africa, to the newly formed nation of Liberia. This was overwhelmingly opposed by the abolitionist movement, who deemed themselves to be Americans, and just as American as their white counterparts, and considered themselves no more African than they considered their white counterparts to be European. Many of the freed slaves who went to Liberia were repatriated against their will. The Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was a system set up by freed slaves and sympathetic whites. It was a route of safe houses leading to the Free States and Canada. Over the course of the history of the railroad, over 100,000 slaves made their way to freedom. Sojourner Truth was an escaped slave, abolitionist, and women's rights activist who helped lead many slaves to freedom. My question to the class is, without the hard work done by women's rights activists, would women have ever achieved the right to vote, or own property, or have control over their own financial destiny? Also, without the work of the abolitionists, would the slaves have ever been freed and recognized as equals to white men.